Hello and good morning from Geneva here to our webinar. The newest webinar we do today, we do it twice today, is on conformity assessment and standards development. This is something which interests many of us because so far either you are in conformity assessment or you're in standards development. So now today David Hanlon, the IEC Secretary of the Conformity Assessment Board, will explain the connection between both of these. And I think this is a really interesting webinar for all of us. We have a high participation today. And yeah, David, you have the floor. I'm looking forward to let you start right now. Okay, let's start.
Okay, thank you. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this webinar. My name is David Hanlon. I'm the Secretary of the IEC Conformity Assessment Board, and this webinar is titled Conformity Assessment and Standards Development. Its objective is to explain why the IEC standards should not have more than a certain amount of conformity assessment in them. The motivation for this webinar was to promote the jointly produced SMB and CAB brochure, which explains what the IEC directives say about conformity assessment, or CA, in IEC normative documents. Unfortunately, the brochure tends to put people to sleep. For this reason, we'll try to make it a little more interesting by telling the story of how to put products on the market.
David, I have one more thing to say, because you just mentioned being interesting. If anybody has a question today, because we will do the webinar and at the end we have a question and answer session, please remember the slide number. You see the slide number here at the lower left side, and write your question into the questions box, and then at the end we will have a look at your question and answer your question. Like this, David will explain all the interesting presentation, and then at the end we will do the best to answer your question. Is this right, David?
That's fine. That's
okay.
Fine. Again, I'll just repeat the last thing I said, because the idea of this webinar is to explain a little bit this brochure, which you can see on the screen where you can find it. The problem with this brochure is that it tends to put people to sleep. For this reason, we're going to try and make it a little bit more interesting by telling a story of how to put products on the market. Now, the main message is if standards are to be used worldwide, they have to avoid national modifications. Therefore, standards should not be in conflict with national laws. Putting conformity assessment requirements in standards could conflict with some laws in some countries. I hope you'll find it interesting and informative. But first, a few basic concepts. The first concept is a question. What is CA? Well, CA is conformity assessment, and conformity assessment is simply the act of assessing conformity of, for example, a product, person, or service to something. In our case, the something is an IEC standard. Conformity assessment is used to demonstrate that conformity has been achieved to the standard. In this way, standards and conformity assessment are like two sides of a coin. Neither side has value without the other side. Only together do standards and conformity assessment create value. The next question is, who does conformity assessment? In the development of their products, manufacturers and suppliers do testing to ensure that those products are conformant. This is first-party conformity assessment. End users and customers also do testing to check that the products they purchase or receive corresponded to the requirements of a standard and possibly to additional specifications. This is second-party conformity assessment. Conformity assessment is also performed by professional testing, inspection, auditing, and certification bodies. These are independent from the manufacturers and the end users. They are like a judge in a court case who can give an impartial judgment. This is third-party conformity assessment. The reasons why conformity assessment is performed depend on who is doing it. Manufacturers and suppliers do CA themselves during product development to ensure that their product development goals are met, they then do CA during production to ensure that their claims of conformity are correct. This allows them to confidently make declarations of conformity for marketing claims and to offer warranties and guarantees and so on. End users and customers do CA to check the conformity of incoming goods as part of their quality control. They may then release payment for those goods or conversely make claims against the supplier. Third-party conformity assessment is performed by professional testing, auditing, inspection and certification bodies. These professional bodies are usually contracted by a manufacturer or supplier to test and certify their products. The manufacturer or supplier then uses the certificate for various purposes. Since IEC standards are intended for use by manufacturers, end users, and certification bodies, testing laboratories, and so on, it is important that the standards are written to allow this. As we've seen, these different standards users are defined that are party neutral. Now, hopefully, we'll make this a little bit more real. For manufacturers, standards are the basis for most everything. Requirements for safety and performance, and so on. Manufacturers then do conformity assessment to confirm conformity. They can then confidently make formal declarations of conformity. Such a declaration of conformity often carries legal implications. To reinforce the notion that standards are the basis for a formal declaration of conformity, we have the example from ISO IEC 17050-1, Conformity Assessment, Supplier's Declaration of Conformity, Part 1, General Requirements. This is the international standard for Supplier's Declaration of Conformity, or SDOC, and it requires that the standard or standards be named. Manufacturers and suppliers make declarations of conformity for various reasons. They may be required to do so by law or by regulations in order to be permitted to sell their products. An example of this is the CE marking in Europe. They may be required to do so by the market because their customers expect it, and if they don't, they would not be able to sell their products. They may also make a declaration of conformity because it's in their best interest to do so. It may be part of a marketing plan in which they wish to promote their safety and quality. Another European example is the German product safety law that does not require a declaration of conformity, but most manufacturers and suppliers do it on a voluntary basis. Manufacturers and suppliers sometimes also do more than make just a self-declaration of conformity. In many situations, they will also seek third-party, independent verification of conformity. This means they will seek to have their products certified. Of course, certification can be very costly, so they need good reasons to do so. And those reasons will vary depending on the product types and market conditions. Again, they may be required to do so by law or by regulations in order to be permitted to sell their products in a specific country. They may be required to do so by the market because their customers expect it. They may also choose to do so as part of a market entry strategy. For example, if they are an unknown brand within a market, they may compete on price, but will also need to show to the market that they have quality. Their way of showing quality will be through certification. The directives state that IEC standards shall not include CA requirements other than those which are necessary to provide repeatable and reproducible conformity assessment results. This generally means testing procedures. Testing is conformity assessment. So the directives are saying that it's okay to include CA requirements if they are testing procedures. In fact, almost the opposite is true. All standards that have requirements should also have good descriptions of how to determine if those requirements have been met. A good standard should have clearly defined, unambiguous and testable requirements and clearly defined, unambiguous, standardized test methods. The exception to this, of course, are standards that don't have requirements, such as terminology standards. So, to summarize what the manufacturers need from standards, they need clearly defined, unambiguous and teams to ensure consistency and repeatability in their conformity assessment results. Lastly, they need standards to be flexible national requirements on them. The manufacturers and suppliers need to demonstrate compliance with those requirements. But the CA requirements vary widely from country to country. The way of demonstrating compliance to national requirements varies widely, depending on the type of product, how and where they will be used, which may then determine whether they are subject to some kind of mandatory conformity assessment, which could involve self-declaration or third-party involvement or governmental involvement. In the case of third-party certification or governmental approval, different levels of conformity assessment may apply. For example, for shipment or batch certification, an ISO IEC 17067 Type 1B scheme would be used. For type certification, a Type 1A scheme would be used, while for full product certification, a Type 5 scheme would be used. Traditionally, only electrical safety was considered, including the risk of fire and electrical shock. However, more and more countries also regulate other aspects, such as EMC, or electromagnetic compatibility, and HF, or high frequency radiation, also hazardous substances and energy efficiency. In many countries, a national or regional label, mark or marking is required. Examples are the European CE marking and the G marking in the Arab Gulf region, which rely on suppliers' declaration. This is typically for lower risk products, while higher risk products may require certification or an approval mark or label. In this case, sometimes a license or agreement to maintain the validity will come with a periodical fee and possible surveillance requirements. Sometimes a test sample of a product must be provided for testing in the target country. What this means is that any existing testing documentation from tests carried out elsewhere is not accepted or is not considered as sufficient in the target country. The test sample may be required for full testing or partial or additional testing or simply for identification purposes. In any case, the provision of a test sample has several implications. It of course raises costs and logistical difficulties. There may be competency issues with the in-country laboratory, and in some cases even the risk of technology theft. But in every case, and perhaps most importantly, it increases the time to market. A longer time to market means lost sales and lost market share, which can be very significant. Sometimes an in-country handler, being an in-country legal entity, is required. This often means no optional import channels and hence restrictions for marketing of the product. On the other hand, it may be useful or even a must in certain countries to have someone locally involved to support and expedite the importation and marketing processes, not least for linguistic and cultural reasons. Sometimes factory visits are required by auditors or inspectors from the target country prior to certifying, approving or releasing of a product for market access. This may be justifiable in the limited case for high-risk, high-cost products. In any case, this countries that have or allow a wider choice of bodies providing recognized certification and approval services. Lower costs and easier access to markets translates to lower prices and greater choice for consumers and end users. In the European example, the CA requirements are given in the EU directives. Harmonized European standards play an important role due to their presumption of conformity. The EU directives and regulations fit the conformity assessment procedures conclusively. When a supplier places the CE marking on its product, there is a presumption that the CA requirements for the module have been met. The veracity of the CE marking concept with its presumption of conformity is backed up with market surveillance, including selection and testing of products already in the market. The CA requirements depend on the category of the product and G to a full quality assurance system type 5 certification in Model H. Modules D and E specify quality management electric shock, fire, and so on, are classified into 11 classes with subcategories. In order to sell these products in the Korean market, a KC mark is needed. The conformity assessment requirements to obtain the KC mark vary according to the risk level of the product. In Korea, there are 3 levels of CA. For high-risk items, full certification of conformity is required and includes factory audits and surveillance. This is type 5 certification. For medium risk items, type 1 certification is required, while for low risk items, a supplier's declaration of conformity is sufficient. In the case where certification is required, the third-party organization must be accredited by CATS, the Korean Agency for Technology and Standards, under the MOTI, which is the Ministry of Trade, Industry and Energy. Testing Agency. In fact, the Canadian and US electrical codes mandate that all products be third-party certified. In Canada, CSA, the Canadian Standards Association, certifies or approves a broad range of products and uses a very similar identifying mark to identify compliance. The CSA and even urinals and toilets. Well, there can be, in some cases, a subtle difference in the mark. The general consumer doesn't understand this. The certification agencies such as CSA and UL, which is Underwriters Laboratories, heavily promote their brand with the message to the consumer, our mark on a product ensures that your buying is safe. For the most part, consumers accept this message without question, even though they don't usually understand the specific meaning. A further complication in North America is that the certification standards for Canada certification organizations are accredited to approve products for both countries. Each has specific certification marks to indicate compliance to one or both countries. The problem for the consumer is that they all look pretty much the same. The use of certification marks to identify some form of compliance are not unique to North America. Many other countries require such marks of certification. Of electrical articles classified as declared articles. Declared articles are those that are typically found in residential homes or are articles which are used frequently by consumers. Examples include dishwashers, hairdryers, room heaters and refrigerators. The list of declared articles is regularly reviewed to take into account emerging new technologies. Accredited, recognized external approval scheme. This means independent third-party certification. The certification process must demonstrate that the electrical article meets all relevant standards. This process includes the testing of these articles in accredited laboratories. Other electrical articles such as flat screen TVs and audio equipment are not declared. However, suppliers must be able to demonstrate compliance with relevant IEC safety standards. This means a first-party approval, also known as Supplier's Declaration or SDOC. Although I won't provide any more individual country or regional examples, a summary of worldwide trends concerning the needs of product certification and approval can be given as follows. In Europe, the situation is quite stable, although some Eastern European countries are not yet entirely aligned with the EU regime for conformity assessment. In the former Soviet Union region, the roles of regional Eurasian versus national conformity assessment regimes are as yet unsettled. Except for Singapore, regulatory CA is expected to increase in Southeast Asia. An example of a country where mandatory CA is reducing is Japan, while in the highly regulated markets of China and South Korea, the trend is to increase. In the US and Canada, mandatory product certification will remain caused largely by the multiple regulatory layers at the federal level versus state and province levels versus even the city level. In Australia and New Zealand, they have chosen to adopt an EU-like CA regime. In Latin America, the Middle East and Africa, some countries have well-established regulatory schemes and other countries are likely to follow. In the Middle East, the roles of the national versus the role of the regional versus the national conformity assessment schemes are so far not quite settled. Coming back to the directives also state that no IEC standard should make normative references to quality management system standards. The reason for this is again related to the CA requirements in different countries. Some countries require QMS in some situations, while others don't. The IEC standards must be written for the widest possible usage. If QMS systems are required, then they should be specified in the national CA requirements. So, to summarize the fundamental elements of standards that are needed for the national application, they need clearly defined, unambiguous and testable requirements. They need standards that can be adopted and that will not conflict with their current or future laws. Therefore, they need the standards to be flexible so that they can be applied, so they can apply their own national CA requirements. For the same standard, it was indicated at the beginning that the motivation for this webinar was to promote the SMB CAB brochure, which explains what the IEC directives say about conformity assessment, or CA, in IEC normative documents. An important and practical part of the brochure is Clause 3. Clause 3 provides a list of terms whose use in IEC standards should be cautioned. The checklist in Clause 3 of the brochure is a short list of terms. There are also many other terms that will raise red flags with the IEC editors if they are used in IEC standards. An example of such a term is neutral. For example, when used in the expression neutral party or neutral body, and so on. In some circumstances, it is quite all right and appropriate or IEC editors before including them. As I said at the beginning, the main message of this webinar is, if standards are to be used worldwide, they must avoid national modifications. Therefore, standards should not be in conflict with national laws. Putting CA requirements in standards could conflict with some laws in some countries. So that's all for this webinar. Now I'm hoping that maybe you have proposed some questions. Certainly now is the time to do so. The situation with questions is, of course, that you have to actually write them and into the system and send them so that I can then see them and hopefully reply to them. So I'm just looking. So there's a question here that says, as an example, only if CSA and FM, etc., is dual certification will be recognized or approved by both countries. Is that right? I'm not certain I fully understand the question. it certainly will depend on whether the certification body has been approved or accredited in both countries and then has the right to apply the mark from the specific country. So it will depend on the accreditation probably of that Okay, I'm struggling a little bit to read the questions. There's a question here that says, slides. The trend in Africa is there are a number of countries that are establishing regulatory schemes. Sometimes the regulatory schemes are between different countries as regional schemes, and they are adopting international standards or are sometimes with national differences, and they are possibly aligning with a European type system. But of course, in many countries in Africa, the schemes and the regulatory programs that they have are quite young and require and are not necessarily extremely mature yet. Looking now to another question. It says, how many countries are actually require national testing? I don't have information on all countries that require national testing, but there are some that do require. Certainly the IEC, you will probably know that the IEC is a standards development organization, but it also operates conformity assessment, global conformity assessment schemes and systems, and those global schemes and systems use conformity assessment bodies from around the world who test and issue test reports and certificates for products, and those test reports then are accepted around the world in most countries. Now, in countries where these are not accepted are the very small minority, and we are working with those countries to get them to accept the IEC certificates that are issued through our CA systems. There are still some countries that require in-house testing if they have the capabilities to do it themselves, but most countries actually accept the IEC issued certificates. There is another question. It says, what is your view to India Bureau of Indian Standards using a copy of IEC standards and adopting it as their own in part? And then I refer to IEC 62133 and testing of lithium and I'm not sure, Ni, cells and batteries. The IEC encourages that the national standards bodies adopt IEC international standards, and that they are adopted as national standards. Sometimes the national standards body must also add national differences if they are legitimate under the World Trade Organization's technical barriers to trade agreement, and that they do not, those additional requirements do not add technical barriers to trade. So the fact that the Indian Bureau of Standards would adopt an IEC international standard is certainly a good thing. The fact that then it may require products coming into India that are based on that standard to be tested and possibly certified, tested by a third party organization and then certified, is a national requirement which India certainly has the right to regulate and apply, as do other countries. So I have personally no issues with that at all. Just looking for another question. Okay. Okay, I can see one here. It says page 16, which I assume means slide 16, the module B is above module C to F. Does it mean module B should be done along with others, or it replaces them, or how? We're talking, of course, about the European directives model, which has 8 modules. As I understand it, the 8 modules are all individual modules, and the generally speaking, the conformity assessment requirements increase from left to right across the matrix that is shown. So when you're starting at the left-hand side, the requirements are the least stringent, meaning simple supplier's self-declaration. And as you move towards the right, the requirements increase, and this is usually related to the risk of the product. For example, a keyboard for a computer is a low-risk item and may only require a supplier to self-declare that the keyboard is compliant with the requirements, and therefore that supplier then puts the CE marking on the product. As the risk increases, for example, if we're talking about products that have a higher risk or that go into a higher risk environment, for example, products going into explosive atmospheres, such as petrol stations, or for the Americans, gas stations, where you fill your car with fuel. This is an explosive atmosphere. An oil refinery or a gas works is a explosive atmosphere. Products going into those environments, of course, can cause damage to people and to property, to the environment, if they cause a fire or an explosion. Therefore, those products require a much stronger form of conformity assessment to demonstrate that those products have been, that those products are actually conformant with the requirements. And in that case, they would require possibly a type 5 conformity assessment, which requires not only testing the product, but also the manufacturer's production facilities with regular surveillance audits and testing of the manufacturer's production and such things that need to be done. So the European system goes from left to right and becomes more and more stringent as you move across. Now, some of the, I think the upper units that span some of the lower units, just showing that they may be applied over a range of risk products, and that they are often relating to where a quality management system has to be in place, has to be audited. Still looking for another question. So there's a question here, can we have a PDF copy of this presentation? And that will certainly be made available afterwards. Just to let you know, anybody who wishes to listen to this again, there is a second webinar on exactly the same subject this afternoon, at least this afternoon at Geneva time, which may be this evening for many of you. It is at 2:30 this afternoon. So if you wish to join again, you're most welcome to do so. Okay, I'm still looking for more questions. There's a question here that says, oh, I've lost it. I'm coming back looking for it. It says, is your presentation for EU based on MDD or MDR? I'm not quite sure what MDD and MDR are, but many of these questions we will also add in a sort of an FAQ system, which we may add to the end of the PDF version of this presentation. Some questions that seem to be typical, we will try and give more better, more complete replies to them. I'm still looking for another question. Okay. It says also, please share the video link of the video download on the IEC Academy webpage in the near future. I've just been informed that the MDD is Medical Device Directive and Medical Device Regulation. There is a question, what is the difference between C marking, which I suppose they meant to mean CE marking certification, and CB certification scheme on the basis of IEC and ICEE and IEC. Well, the CE mark, of course, is a European marking. It is a marking which is different from a mark. A mark is an indication that is owned by some organization, and to apply the mark, an organization has to be authorized to do so, and this is where issues such as licensing for the mark and other issues may come into play. The European CE marking is a marking that anybody, any supplier can apply to their product if they comply with the requirements of that marking. There is, as I said in the presentation, there is a presumption in the EU directives system. There is a presumption of compliance when a CE marking is on the product. In general, there is no check or control to see whether the requirements for the CE marking have actually been met, although there is market surveillance which goes on. So certain products are taken from the market and requirements. Now, the CB scheme, which is one of the, which is a third-party scheme, conformity assessment scheme under the IEC, is, as I said, third-party, so it is certification. A test report or a certificate issued under the CB scheme is a test report or certificate issued by a third-party organization, testing laboratory or a certification body that has been qualified under the IEC system and is therefore authorized and approved to issue such test reports and certificates within the IEC system. This is called a CB test report or a CB certificate. This then is used market requirements and then provides access to those markets because the requirements in those markets have been demonstrated to be compliant. So the CE marking is a self-declaration by a supplier, and a CB scheme certificate is a third-party, professional, independent testing and certification of a product. So the two things are quite different. So still looking. Okay, so that's about all the questions I can read at the moment. So since this webinar doesn't actually allow any feedback than the questions that you write, it's difficult for me to gauge any more information for you. So I will, I think, close the webinar at this stage, or at least I will stop speaking. If you have any more questions, please add them over the next 10 minutes before the webinar itself is closed. And we will look through those questions and try and answer them all, or most of them, those that we understand in any case. And we will add those replies to the PDF for this presentation, which will be made available hopefully later today, certainly if not later today, in the very near future. I thank you very much for your time, and I hope this has been interesting for you. Again, thank you and good morning.